This is a voice speaking from America.
A voice from America at war.
Our voices are coming to you from New York, across the Atlantic Ocean to London, from where they are relayed to you in Germany.
Today, America has been at war for 79 days.
Daily at this time, we shall speak to you about America and the war. The news may be good or bad. We shall tell you the truth.
1941. America has been thrust into World War II. Across the world, propaganda is flying off the presses, rousing patriotism and vilifying minority groups. At the time, the United States remained one of the only leading nations without an international broadcasting service. This was until the creation of Voice of America, which allowed the American government to relay information to citizens across Europe and Asia. Then, with the rise of the Cold War, Voice of America and its satellite programs became increasingly important, and the recently established Radio Free Europe became a major catalyst for change in Eastern Europe. Decades later, Radio Martí, America's broadcasting service to Cuba, was created but did not succeed and only generated controversy. America's broadcasting services demonstrated a valiant effort at diplomacy. They sought to educate citizens of foreign nations and inform them of the actions of their governments. However, America's broadcasting services also sparked intense international debates, and several foreign nations sought to block the broadcasts. From an American perspective, the United States international broadcasting services have long served as a way to provide uncensored and unbiased news to people around the world while forging international connections. However, the debate surrounding these stations demonstrates that what constitutes propaganda is largely based on perspective. In 1941, President Roosevelt established the U.S. Foreign Information Service with speechwriter Roger Sherwood at its head. This was the start of the United States' first government-sponsored international radio service, Voice of America. With the end of World War II, Voice of America's many services came to a close. However, with the growing Cold War, the American government felt it was once again time to escalate its efforts at international broadcasting. Beginning in 1945, an Iron Curtain divided Europe into East and West. In the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries, citizens were unable to access information outside their communist sphere, which left them primarily with anti-Western propaganda. People living in the Communist East were not exposed to any other views of America. USSR leaders tried to control the channels of information in the East as strictly as possible because they knew that once citizens could access an alternative perspective, they may lose their chokehold on power. Alongside Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, or RFE, provided an alternate yet illicit news source to those living in the Eastern Bloc. Radio Free Europe first began transmitting radio broadcasts to Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Poland from its headquarters in the 1950s. Radio Liberty, a sister organization of RFE, also expanded to broadcast into the USSR. While RFE supplied accurate programming, it clashed with the information and propaganda disseminated in Eastern Bloc countries. According to C.D. Jackson, who served as the president of the Free Europe Committee, the purpose of RFE was to create conditions of chaos in the country where the broadcast reached. RFE provided a platform to underground activists, exiles, and defectors to discuss the true actions of the governments in Eastern Bloc countries. Steve Simmons was the former chair of the Board for International Broadcasting and chair of the RFE committee. His position allowed him to observe firsthand the empowering effects of the platform.
Soviet people at that time had no means of getting accurate information about what was happening in the world, so it would broadcast shortwave radio, a huge audience, and people would stay up at night, they'd hide their transmitters. Millions of people listened.
These radio services were an obvious threat to the agenda of the USSR and other Warsaw Pact countries, so these governments sought various means of suppressing them. Soviet Politburo members Ligachev and Chebrikov wrote in a memorandum to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, or CPSU, that at the present time, jamming of 8 foreign radio stations is being carried out. The broadcasts of the non-governmental radio stations, Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe, have an openly anti-Soviet character and abound with malicious slander of Soviet reality. From the Soviet perspective, RFE was a form of American propaganda that they felt they must brutally suppress to remain in power. On the contrary, Americans initially formed RFE because they felt that Soviet news sources were propaganda and sought to introduce a different perspective to Soviet society. Although Americans were not explicitly building international relations with Soviet countries, these attempts at sharing different perspectives represented a desire for honest dialogue and diplomacy. The CPSU attempted to carry out broadcast blockage by jamming U.S. broadcasts with other sounds and strategically scheduling other radio programming. For example, the Communist parties of Azerbaijan and Estonia scheduled popular radio broadcasts to occur at the same time as Radio Free Europe in order to discourage citizens from listening. Eastern Bloc countries also tried to suppress Radio Free Europe through more violent means. In 1978, Bulgarian RFE journalist Georgy Markov was mysteriously killed in London after being stabbed in the leg by an umbrella with a pellet of uranium and pectin hidden inside. In 1981, Radio Free Europe's Munich headquarters were bombed in an operation underwritten by the Romanian government and Venezuelan militant Carlos the Jackal. In the end, Radio Free Europe served as a major catalyst in the fall of the USSR and the end of communism in Eastern Europe. For example, in 1956, RFE released broadcasts that detailed the methods of the secret police and exposed the Communist Party elite in Poland. These broadcasts, along with widespread economic discontent in Poland, motivated the Poznan Revolt of 1956. In fact, during the revolt, the protesters destroyed the transmitter used to jam Western broadcasting stations. Additionally, RFE provided a platform to major revolutionary figures like Lech Walesa in Poland and Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia. Radio Free Europe exemplified the idea that access to multiple perspectives is power for citizens living under oppressive regimes. While RFE still exists in some Eastern European countries, it has largely been phased out because of the establishment of democratic governments and free press policies. Radio Free Europe provided a sense of interconnectedness to citizens of divided countries, demonstrating the media's powerful influence in strengthening international relations. Even though Radio Free Europe saw success, Radio Martí, which attempted to spread information to Cuban citizens during Fidel Castro's rule, was ineffective and riddled with corruption. The American radio service was led by what the New York Times considers a once monolithic lobbying group of Cuban exiles. Radio Martí's reporters continually used both propaganda and false information, damaging their credibility. Steve Simmons said that
we have Radio Martí, which we probably shouldn't have in Cuba.
The intentions behind Radio Martí were much more problematic compared to those behind Radio Free Europe. For example, a report by the U.S. Agency for Global Media found that Radio Martí largely broadcasted stories that were critical of the governments of Nicaragua, Venezuela, and especially Cuba. One Radio Martí host referred to the Cuban government as cancer in one of her segments and said that Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, takes the food off the plate of his own children. Therefore, Radio Martí has not succeeded in drawing large audiences or benefiting the political climate of Cuba. A report by the U.S. Accounting Office stated that although Radio Martí claimed that practically all of Cuban territory had access to it, less than 1% of Cubans actually viewed TV Martí without disruption. The Cuban government has proved more successful at blocking out Radio Martí's broadcasts than the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, in part due to its geographically isolated position. Ultimately, Radio Martí failed at forging relations with Cuban citizens and created hostility within American radio services. For American citizens in the Cold War, RFE's discussions of anti-Soviet views may seem like objective truth, while for Soviets it may be perceived as propaganda attempting to garner support for the United States. However, during the Cold War, RFE served a crucial and inherently beneficial function because it introduced alternative perspectives to populations largely oppressed by their governments. In the case of Radio Martí, the station has a negative effect due to its bias and failure to introduce any new perspectives or positive changes in Cuba. These radio stations continue to be an important form of diplomacy, and they have sparked important debates about propaganda and when it's appropriate. America's foreign broadcasting services serve a uniquely complex role in foreign policy, in which they primarily seek to introduce different perspectives to foreign nations. Currently, the Russian government is working to censor the Russian people's access to news so that they remain in the dark regarding Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The services of news sources like Radio Free Europe could once again be used to help maintain international peace and combat authoritarianism.